I'll never forget that morning briefing. There we were, 6 of us crammed into the secure room, the air thick with tension as our commander pointed to the satellite images. These civilians are in a known terrorist zone. We can't risk extraction. His words felt like lead in my stomach. I've been flying combat missions for 12 years, but this was different. The intel showed at least 300 refugees trapped in that valley, with enemy forces closing in from the east. Command decision was final. No intervention, too risky to our aircraft and pilots. As I walked out, I couldn't shake the image of those makeshift shelters, those people who had no idea what was coming for them in less than 24 hours. Back in my quarters, I pulled out the detailed maps of the region. The valley was indeed surrounded by heavy anti-aircraft installations, a veritable death trap for conventional approach. But there was one route, through the narrow canyon to the north that our intelligence had marked as impassable due to radar coverage. I'd flown similar terrain in the Caucasus during training exercises. Dangerous? Absolutely. Impossible? I wasn't convinced. I kept thinking about my own family back home, how I'd want someone to try if they were trapped. The mission parameters kept running through my head as I tried to sleep that night, along with the faces I'd never seen, but couldn't stop imagining. Dawn came, and with it my decision. I reported for my scheduled reconnaissance flight, but I'd made modifications to my flight plan that only I knew about. My F-16 was loaded with standard armament, nothing unusual to raise suspicion. As I taxied to the runway, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear the tower's clearance. This wasn't just career suicide. If I was wrong about that canyon approach, it would be actual suicide. But something deep inside me, beyond training and regulation, whispered that those civilians deserve at least one person willing to try. The engines roared as I took off, climbing into the clear blue sky, knowing that in 30 minutes, I'd either be making the most important decision of my career or my last. As I reached cruising altitude, I switched off the mission recording system, a serious violation by itself. My palms were sweating inside my flight gloves. Just a normal recon, I reminded myself, keeping radio communication routine and by the book. When I reached the waypoint where I need to diverge from my assigned flight path, I took one deep breath. Everything I've been taught about following orders, about chain of command, about military discipline, it all flashed through my mind in an instant. Then I banked hard right, descending rapidly toward the mouth of the canyon, officially becoming what the military calls rogue. The point of no return. My hand steadied as I focused on what was ahead, thread the needle through the canyon, avoid detection, reach the civilians before the enemy did. I'd deal with the consequences later, if there was a later. The moment I turned toward that canyon, everything changed. My radar warning receiver started chirping. They were already tracking me, but hadn't locked on yet. I dropped to just 100 feet above the ground, the F-16 screaming as I pushed it to its limits. The canyon walls rose on either side, jagged rock formations threatening to tear my wings off with the slightest miscalculation. This wasn't flying anymore. It was threading a needle at 500 miles per hour. The gravitational forces pressed me hard into my seat as I navigated each turn, my vision narrowing, breaths coming in controlled bursts. You never forget that feeling, that intense focus where the aircraft becomes an extension of your body. The canyon narrowed, barely wider than my wingspan at points. I had to roll the aircraft sideways to squeeze through one particularly tight section, the wing tips seemingly inches from the rock walls. One wrong move, one unexpected air pocket, and I'd be another statistic, another pilot who overestimated his skills. My headset was alive with chatter. They'd noticed my course deviation back at base. Viper 3, report position. You're off course. Acknowledge. I maintained radio silence. Every word I spoke now would be evidence against me later. The G-forces from the sudden turns and altitude changes were making it hard to breathe, hard to think, but I kept pushing forward, using the terrain to mask my approach from enemy radar systems. Halfway through the canyon, I encountered what nearly ended everything. A flock of birds scattered by my approach. In that split second, pure instinct took over. I didn't have time to think, just react, rolling right while maintaining my dangerously low altitude. Two birds struck the canopy with sickening thuds, but thankfully the reinforced glass held. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The navigation system was useless here. This was all visual flying, the kind they can't fully teach you in simulators. I was flying on feel, on memory of the maps I'd studied, and on the desperate hope that my calculations about radar coverage were correct. If I was detected now, in this narrow passageway, I'd have nowhere to go, no way to evade. The canyon began to widen as I approached its end, which meant both relief and new danger. I'd soon lose the protection of the rock walls and be exposed to enemy radar and potential anti-aircraft fire. The refugee encampment should be just beyond the valley opening, according to the satellite images. As I approached the canyon exit, I eased the throttle back slightly, preparing for what might be waiting. My mind raced through combat scenarios, evasive maneuvers, weapon systems checks. I was alone out here, completely unsupported, about to potentially face enemy forces while trying to evacuate hundreds of civilians. But as the canyon walls fell away and the valley opened up before me, what I saw made my blood run cold. The satellite images hadn't shown the half of it. There were not 300 refugees, there were easily twice that number. And on the eastern ridge, just as predicted, dust clouds were rising. The enemy forces were already approaching, much closer than intelligence had estimated. I had minutes, not hours. The moment I cleared the canyon, I activated my targeting systems and scanned the horizon. 3 miles east, a column of military vehicles was advancing toward the refugee camp. I counted at least 15, including what appeared to be mobile artillery. They hadn't spotted me yet, but that wouldn't last long. I made a quick pass over the refugee encampment, flying low enough for them to see me clearly. I needed them to know help had arrived, that they weren't abandoned. The sight below was heart-wrenching. Makeshift tents, huddled groups of people, the elderly and children visible even from my altitude. Some people waved desperately, others scattered in fear, probably traumatized by previous air attacks. I banked hard and circled back toward the approaching enemy column. I switched to air-to-ground missiles and targeted the lead vehicles first. The familiar tone in my headset confirmed target lock, and I pressed the launch button without hesitation. 2 missiles streaked away from my aircraft, leaving white trails against the blue sky. For seconds later, the lead vehicles erupted in flames and black smoke. The rest of the column immediately halted and began to disperse, but they were in open terrain with limited cover. I made another attack run, this time using my 20mm cannon on the remaining vehicles. The cannon roared, its vibration shuddering through the airframe, as I watched armor-piercing rounds tear into trucks and light armor. Part of me recognized the clinical detachment I'd entered. This was what I'd trained for, the muscle memory taking over. After the third pass, most of the enemy column was disabled, but I'd used a significant portion of my ammunition. Worse, I'd now been in the area long enough for any nearby enemy forces to be alerted. My radar warning receiver suddenly blared to life. Someone had just illuminated me with targeting radar. I instinctively deployed countermeasures and pulled into a steep climb, scanning the skies. There was 2 aircraft approaching from the northeast, moving fast. The IFF system identified them as MiG-29s, which meant I was now outgunned and outnumbered. In a fair fight, those odds would be nearly impossible. But I wasn't looking for a fair fight. I just needed to buy enough time for those refugees to move to safety. I pushed the F-16 into a diving turn, using the valley terrain to break the enemy radar lock. My mind was racing through options, calculating fuel reserves, weapon loads, escape routes. Radio chatter was continuous now, both from my base demanding my return and encrypted enemy communications I couldn't understand but could definitely hear. The G-forces for my evasive maneuvers were intense, pushing the limits of what the human body can endure. My vision began to narrow, the edges darkening as blood rushed from my head. I grunted, tensing my muscles to force blood back to my brain, fighting to stay conscious. As I pulled out of the dive, I caught sight of the refugee camp again. They were moving, streaming toward the western end of the valley where they might find safety. That sight gave me renewed purpose. I turned to face the approaching fighters, knowing what I had to do next would put everything on the line. I was 1 against 2, with limited ammunition and fuel, cut off from support. But those people needed just a little more time. The MiGs split formation as they approached, a classic pincer maneuver to trap me between them. I'd faced this before in training, but never with actual missiles being fired at me. The sky suddenly filled with the bright streak of an air-to-air missile launched from the lead MiG. My threat warning system screamed in my ear as I initiated a hard brake right, deploying chaff and flares in a desperate attempt to confuse the missile's guidance system. The G-forces slammed me into my seat as the missile streaked past, missing by what felt like inches. There's no training that truly prepares you for the visceral terror of watching a missile designed to kill you sail past your canopy. My breathing was ragged, adrenaline flooding my system as I reversed direction, trying to gain position on the first MiG. I managed to get behind one of them, achieving a missile lock for a brief moment. I didn't hesitate, launching one of my precious few remaining air-to-air missiles. The enemy pilot was good, though, braking hard and deploying countermeasures. My missile detonated close enough to damage his aircraft, but not destroy it. I could see smoke trailing from his right engine as he disengaged, heading east. One down, at least temporarily, but the second MiG was now on my tail, and my fuel situation was becoming critical. Each high-G maneuver consumed precious fuel I couldn't afford to lose. The radio crackled with a new message from base. They were scrambling additional aircraft to my position. Help was coming, but would it arrive in time? The remaining MiG pilot was skilled, staying with me through a series of increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers. My muscles ached from the strain of fighting the G-forces, my flight suit soaked with sweat. I pulled into a vertical climb, knowing it was risky with my fuel state, but needing to force him into an overshoot. As we climbed almost straight up, I watched my airspeed bleed off rapidly. This was the dangerous part, the moment where a fighter can become a sitting duck. Just as my airspeed approached stall, I kicked the rudder hard, performing a maneuver we call the falling leaf, essentially stalling the aircraft intentionally and using aerodynamic controls to force a specific direction in the stall. The F-16 shuddered violently as it lost lift, beginning to fall while rotating. The MiG shot past me, unable to match the maneuver without preparation. As my aircraft tumbled briefly before I regained control, I caught a glimpse of the refugee column continuing their movement west. They'd made significant progress, now almost to the valley exit where the rocky terrain would provide better cover. I had my shot on the MiG now and locked my last air-to-air missile. The tone confirmed a solid lock, and I fired, watching the missile track true to its target. The MiG exploded in a fireball, debris raining down across the valley floor. There was no parachute. The momentary relief was quickly replaced by the reality of my situation. I was now deep in enemy territory, critically low on fuel and ammunition, with an aircraft that had been pushed beyond its design limits during combat. My warning systems indicated damage to multiple systems. The mission was accomplished. The refugees were reaching safety. The immediate enemy threat was neutralized, but my chances of making it home were dwindling by the second. I had to make a decision. Try for the border where friendly forces might intercept me, or attempt the canyon again with a damaged aircraft and dangerously low fuel. With my fuel gauge flashing red warnings, I made the call. I'd attempt the canyon again. It was shorter than trying to reach the border, and the terrain might hide me from any additional enemy aircraft scrambling to the area. I banked toward the canyon entrance, the F-16 feeling sluggish with the damage it had sustained. Warning lights illuminated my cockpit like a Christmas tree. Hydraulic pressure dropping, fuel critical, right aileron damage. The beautiful machine that had responded so precisely earlier was now wounded, requiring all my skill just to keep it tracking straight. I thought of all the maintenance crews who'd kept this aircraft in perfect condition over the years, how they'd shake their heads at what I'd done to it. If I made it back, I'd owe them more than apologies. Entering the canyon this time was different. I was flying a compromised aircraft with reflexes dulled by combat fatigue and the after effects of extreme G-forces. The first turn came up fast, too fast. I overcompensated, the wingtips scraping the canyon wall with a horrific screeching sound that reverberated through the entire airframe. Metal fragments tore away, creating new warning alarms. My breathing was shallow now, each inhale deliberate as I fought rising panic. Just fly the plane, I whispered to myself, the mantra they teach you from day one. Focus on the next turn, the next second, nothing else. The canyon walls became a blur as I pushed forward, knowing that any hesitation could be fatal. My fuel situation had moved beyond critical. I was now flying on fumes. Halfway through the canyon, my engine began to sputter. Fuel starvation was setting in sooner than I'd calculated. The sudden loss of thrust pitched the nose down, and I had to pull back hard on the stick to avoid plowing straight into the canyon floor. The aircraft responded sluggishly, barely clearing a rock outcropping. Sweat stung my eyes, but I didn't dare release the controls to wipe it away. Each breath felt like it might be my last in this world. The radio had been silent, either damaged or because I was too deep in the canyon for signals to reach me. It was just me, a failing aircraft, and the unforgiving stone walls closing in from both sides. In that moment, strange as it sounds, I felt an odd sense of peace. If this was it, at least it was in service of something that mattered. Somehow, through some combination of skill, desperation, and sheer luck, I emerged from the canyon. The open sky never looked so beautiful. But my momentary relief vanished as the engine gave one final protest and then went silent. Dead stick, every pilot's nightmare. I was gliding now, with no power, in a damaged aircraft, still miles from the nearest friendly airfield. The altimeter unwound rapidly as I lost altitude. I ran through emergency procedures automatically, tried to restart the engine, but knew it was futile with no fuel. My options were stark: eject and abandon the aircraft, or attempt a dead-stick landing on whatever flat terrain I could find. The ejection decision needed to come soon, too low, and the parachute wouldn't have time to deploy fully. But I couldn't bring myself to abandon the aircraft yet, not after what we'd been through together. I spotted what looked like a dry riverbed below, not ideal but flat enough maybe. As I guided the powerless fighter toward it, I rehearsed the landing in my mind. No engine meant one chance, no go-around possible. The ground rushed up to meet me as I descended, the airspeed bleeding off despite my best efforts to maintain a glide. In those final moments, thoughts of home, family, and the refugees I'd helped flash through my mind in rapid succession. Whatever happened next, I'd made a difference today. I don't remember much about the landing itself, just fragments of sensations. The horrific screeching of metal on stone, the impact that slammed me against my harness with brutal force, the smell of fuel and hot metal. Then darkness. I woke to the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors and the face of a pararescue jumper leaning over me. "You crazy son of a bitch," he said with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You actually did it." I was alive, though my body felt broken in ways I couldn't yet catalog. As they loaded me onto the helicopter, I caught a glimpse of my F-16, or what remained of it, a mangled heap of metal stretched across the riverbed. A $20 million write-off. In that moment, I knew my career was over, but I couldn't bring myself to regret my decision. The debrief was exactly as brutal as I'd expected. I sat in a sterile room at the base hospital, still hooked to IVs, facing 3 stern-faced officers. They laid out the charges: disobeying direct orders, unauthorized engagement with enemy forces, reckless endangerment of military assets, going radio silent during combat operations, enough violations to end a dozen careers. I didn't offer excuses, just stated facts. Approximately 600 refugees were now safe who would otherwise likely be dead. The commander, a colonel with 3 decades of service etched into the lines on his face, stared at me for a long moment. "You violated every principle of chain of command and military discipline," he said finally. "But satellite confirms the refugee column reached safety." and intel reports the enemy force you engaged was planning a massacre. What followed was a storm of conflicting reactions within the military structure. Some viewed me as the worst kind of insubordinate, the kind whose success only encourages others to question orders. Others saw a hero who'd made a moral choice when regulations failed. My medical recovery took months. 3 broken ribs, a fractured femur, concussion, and various internal injuries from the crash landing. The physical pain paled compared to the uncertainty of my future. The military justice system moved with deliberate slowness. I was neither officially punished nor exonerated, left in a peculiar limbo. Meanwhile, leaked details of the mission sparked public interest. Journalists began asking questions about refugees saved by a rogue pilot. Politicians weighed in, some condemning my actions, others praising them. I remained silent, following at least that military protocol. 6 months after that fateful flight, I sat across from the general who would decide my fate. His office was austere, with only a few photographs and medals hinting at his own combat history. "You understand the impossibility of the position you've put us in," he said without preamble. "If we court-martial you, we create a public relations nightmare and possibly a hero martyr. If we commend you, we effectively tell every pilot they can ignore orders when they personally disagree." I nodded, having wrestled with this same dilemma during my long recovery. He slid a document across the desk. Honorable discharge. Full medical benefits. No formal commendation, no formal punishment. A middle path, politically expedient for the military, neither endorsing nor fully condemning my actions. Part of me wanted to argue, to demand recognition for those refugees saved, but the wiser part recognized the gift I was being offered. 2 weeks later, I turned to my wings, a ceremony attended only by a handful of fellow pilots who'd chosen to stand with me despite the controversy. As I walked off the base for the last time, a civilian now after 15 years of service, I was approached by a man in a nondescript suit. "There are other ways to serve," he said simply, handing me a plain business card with only a phone number. "People with your moral clarity are rare and valuable." I didn't respond, just pocketed the card and continued walking. My military career was over, but perhaps my service wasn't. The nightmares still came, the canyon walls closing in, the missiles streaking past my canopy, the faces of enemies I'd killed. But they were balanced by something else, the knowledge that hundreds of people were alive because I'd chosen to act. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd take out that business card and consider the possibilities. There are choices that end one path but open another. There are orders that must be followed, and others that must be questioned. The hardest part is knowing the difference, and living with the consequences, whatever they may be. 6 months after my discharge, I received a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph and a handwritten note in shaky English. The photo showed a group of children playing in what appeared to be a refugee camp, their faces bright with laughter despite their surroundings. The note read simply, "You do not know us. We do not know you, but we live because of you." I sat on my porch staring at that photo for hours, emotions I couldn't name washing over me. In all the aftermath, the medical recovery, the military hearings, the media speculation, I'd never actually heard from the people most affected by my decision. This tangible proof that real lives have been saved hit me in a way all the theoretical discussions of ethics and duty never had. These weren't statistics or talking points. They were people with futures now, futures they might never have had. Through careful inquiries and some contact from my mysterious business card acquaintance, I managed to learn more about the refugees. They were predominantly from a religious minority targeted by both government forces and extremist groups in the region. The valley they'd been trapped in was their third attempted sanctuary after being driven from their homes. Most had been traveling for months, carrying whatever possessions they could on their backs or in the few vehicles they possessed. Among them were doctors, teachers, farmers, craftspeople, the full spectrum of society displaced by conflict. Learning these details transformed my understanding of my own actions. It wasn't just that I'd saved lives. I'd saved culture, knowledge, traditions, and possibilities that might otherwise have been extinguished. Against all advice and several international travel warnings, I arranged to visit the refugee camp where many of them had been resettled. Security concerns meant I couldn't announce my visit in advance, and I wasn't sure how I'd be received or if anyone would even know who I was. I arrived on a sweltering summer day. The camp, a sprawling collection of tents and prefabricated structures, spread across a dusty plain. My guide, a local aid worker, hadn't been told my background, just that I was a former military pilot interested in humanitarian work. As we walked through the camp, children ran alongside us, fascinated by any new visitor. The conditions were basic but organized: water stations, medical tents, makeshift classrooms. People nodded politely as we passed, going about their daily routines with a resilience that never ceases to amaze me. Then it happened. An older man stopped in his tracks, staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. He approached slowly, said something to my guide in their language, and then reached out to grasp my hand in both of his. "The pilot," he said in accented English, tears forming in his eyes. "You are the pilot." Word spread through the camp with astonishing speed. Within minutes, we were surrounded by people, all wanting to touch me, thank me, show me their children. They brought out food, insisted I eat with them despite having so little themselves. A young woman who spoke English well explained that they had seen my aircraft that day, recognized it was fighting the approaching enemy, watched as I engaged the MiGs. They had prayed for me when they saw my aircraft take damage. "We did not know if you survived," she said simply. "We hoped. We prayed." That night, sitting among people who by all military calculations should have been sacrificed for strategic considerations, I understood something profound about duty and humanity that no military manual could ever capture. These people didn't care about geopolitics or military doctrine or chain of command. They cared that someone had seen their value, their right to exist, when others had written them off as acceptable losses. I've been asked many times if I would make the same decision again. Knowing the consequences, the end of my military career, the physical injuries, the ongoing debates about whether I was a hero or a dangerous precedent. It's never been a difficult question to answer. There are nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, the canyon walls closing in around me in my dreams, the missiles streaking past my canopy. The body remembers trauma long after the mind has processed it. But then I look at the photo of those children now framed on my wall, and the answer is always, unequivocally yes. Some choices transcend career considerations or even personal safety. Some moments demand we act according to a deeper calling than protocols or orders. The difficult part isn't making those choices in the heat of the moment. It's living with them afterward, explaining them to those who weren't there. What surprised me most in the years following was how my story took on a life of its own. It became a case study in military ethics courses, debated by philosophers, referenced by politicians arguing both for military discipline and humanitarian intervention. I was approached to write books, give interviews, even consult on a film. I declined most offers, uncomfortable with being portrayed either as an unqualified hero or as a cautionary tale. The truth, as always, was more nuanced than any headline could capture. I did eventually agree to speak at select military academies, not to glorify my actions, but to ensure future officers understood the complexity of the moral calculations they might face. Orders matter, I would tell them. Chain of command matters. But so does your humanity. The hardest skill you'll ever develop is knowing when one must yield to the other. 3 years after that fateful flight, I found myself in Washington, D.C., called to provide testimony for a congressional committee examining military engagement rules in humanitarian crises. As I waited outside the hearing room, a military aide approached with a message. The Secretary of Defense wished to speak with me privately before the hearing. I was led to a small conference room where a man I'd seen only on television stood waiting. He dismissed his staff and asked me to sit. "I've read every report on your incident," he said without preamble. 17 times we've refined our protocols for similar situations based on what you experienced. He paused, studying me intently. "The public narrative is simplified. Either you're a hero who broke bad rules, or you're a dangerous maverick who got lucky. The reality is that you exposed a gap in our decision-making framework that needed addressing. That conversation changed my understanding of my own legacy. My actions hadn't just saved those specific refugees, they had forced a re-examination of how such situations are handled. New protocols were developed that better balanced military objectives with humanitarian considerations. No pilot should ever have to make the choice I did, to follow orders or conscience, because the orders themselves should incorporate both strategic and moral dimensions. I still receive letters occasionally from military personnel facing difficult decisions, from refugees in various conflicts, even from family members of pilots who made similar choices with less fortunate outcomes. I answer each one personally, never offering easy answers, but always emphasizing that we are humans first, before we're soldiers or pilots or officers. The uniform doesn't change that fundamental truth. Sometimes in the quiet moments, I find myself looking up at passing aircraft, feeling that familiar pull. I miss flying every day, the freedom, the precision, the brotherhood of pilots. But I've found new purpose in consulting on humanitarian evacuation planning, using my experience to help bridge the gap between military capabilities and humanitarian needs. The canyon walls still haunt my dreams, but now they're balanced by other images. Children playing in a dusty camp, an old man grasping my hand in gratitude, former colleagues implementing new protocols that might mean the next pilot doesn't have to choose between duty and humanity. Some prices are worth paying. Some lines are worth crossing. And sometimes, the most important mission we fly isn't found in any official orders.